Hey friends, welcome to a new day. This is Zen, and thank you for joining me once again on my journey coming back from fear. Today is episode 4, and this one is called The Deep Dive. In the last episodes, we have looked at where fear is born, what it does to us, how we can begin to interrupt our flight mode so that we can begin to question our conditional love laws. In this episode, we will focus on how the heck I can question myself and how I can do that without setting off all sorts of alarms and whistles, taking me back into that mode where I can't really think much at all. There was a princess who lived in a vast kingdom, and she enjoyed taking trips during the spring and summer to the cities and villages that were far from the castle, to visit and encourage the people. As her small entourage approached one of the small fortified cities at the very edge of the territory, they were greeted by city guards who rushed them into the keep. And once they were safe inside, the princess went to the captain of the guard to find out what was going on. He mentioned that there was a giant outside the gates that had been threatening the inhabitants of the fort. And just as he finished speaking, from outside the gates, you could hear a deep, loud voice demanding that they bring it food. The soldiers and the princess, they scurried to the high fortified walls to look out at what was making all the racket. And there stood this huge giant, at least 30 feet tall, and everyone gasped in fear. And when no one responded to the giant's request, he began to hurl boulders at the wall. Everyone retreated into the cellar of the inner buildings for safety. And they waited it out, and eventually the attack subsided. How long has this been going on? The princess questioned. Since winter started, was the response she had received. They were a bit embarrassed about how long it had been going on, and that they had not really tried to deter the giant by attacking it. They, in fact, had appeased it for a bit, shooting out food to it by catapult until food supplies for themselves had started to become a concern. Has anyone tried talking to it? The royal daughter asked. And she was met with wide eyes and frightened faces. Standing up and dusting off her dress, straightening her hair, to become presentable for a peace discussion, the princess made her way up the stairs to the door of the cellar. She opened the door confidently, though her hands were shaking a bit from the adrenaline that had begun to flow in her. The guards tried to reason with her with respect, but she would not listen. She reached the fort gate and demanded that they open it. And when they did, she stepped out boldly to find that no one was there. The giant had stepped away, evidently. And she breathed a sigh of relief a bit and walked around a little outside of the gate, acting as if she was looking for the giant, while secretly inside she was becoming more and more grateful that her opponent was not present. So she stepped back into the gate and shrugged her shoulders, and they all went to the feast hall to celebrate and have some food. And as they were finishing up their supper, the hall grew silent as the familiar deep voice of the giant rumbled through the fort. He was back. All eyes went to the princess. She took a big drink of water, wiped her mouth with her napkin, and gently placed it on the table as she slowly stood up. Everyone joined her and followed her out of the hall. She did not bother go to the top of the wall to see the giant because she didn't want to lose her nerve. Straight to the gate she went, and once again demanded the door be opened. This time, she asked for the captain's sword. And as she stepped out of the door, she stopped in her tracks. The giant was there, and he was much closer than he was before. He was shouting derogatory things about the kingdom, how weak it was, and that they should all be ashamed of themselves for thinking they were anything except his servants. She was ready to flee, but suddenly she was ready to fight. She took a deep breath and took a couple of steps toward the giant. He laughed and pointed at her. She took a few more steps. The giant laughed a little less, and it seemed to the princess that he wasn't quite as tall as he was before. She was getting braver and began a steady pace toward the giant. The more steps she took towards this enormous creature, the smaller that he became. And when she reached just a few paces away from the brute, he was barely a foot tall. Even then, he lunged at her with his small spear. And reacting to his attack, the princess swung her sword in front of her, hitting her opponent square in the middle of his chest. Falling to the ground, he screamed, and the princess suddenly felt bad, and she reached down to help him. He just looked into her eyes and smiled. "Who are you?" she asked. His answer was simple, and it was in a whisper. "I am fear." And so the story goes. Fear does seem so large and so scary when we keep it a secret, and when we don't face it. But when we do, it does become smaller and smaller and smaller, and we eventually see it for the lie that it was. Directly facing the fear is the ultimate outcome. It will never go away. It will only grow larger and more demanding of our lives the more we don't face it. And it can be a tricky adventure, facing our fears. It's like one of those invisible fences for dogs, where when we get closer to it, we begin to feel a little tingle. Get a little closer, it starts to sting. And if we get too close, bam! But doing the inquiry on paper can keep us far enough away from the sharp pain, being an observer on a train, watching the scenery as we go by it, rather than being an active participant in it. A wonderful author and speaker, Byron Katie, she has an amazing life-changing process called, it's a Hate Your Neighbor worksheet. And you basically step through, an uncomfortable emotion. And it's definitely, like I mentioned, it is life-changing. And you can check it out for free at her website. It's called thework.com. So TheWork.com. My personal deep dive, before I discovered Byron Katie, I started off by just asking myself, what am I fearing? And then I would take it to the next level lower of what am I really fearing? And then to the next, and then to the next, continually asking myself, what am I really feeling? What am I really feeling? Starting with the next episode after this one, I will start giving examples by topic on questioning, getting to the root of common fears that we all share at one time or another. So that'll help kind of bring clarity around it as well. But the more I evaluated my fears, and boy, did I have plenty of them, I noticed that at the bottom root fear, it was coming down to just a few basic ones, really three. Number one was I was fearing what people would think, or what I thought they would think, and that it would end up with them rejecting me and me being alone. Number two was I was fearing what God would think. This mighty being that I had been taught was the judger and punisher of all people and things, and who knows what the end result would be at that point. And then finally, number three, I was fearing a painful death. Now that last one really is our survival instinct, and it is designed to keep us in this game as long as possible. The first and second are really emotional, conditioned, made-up threats. Fearing what people will think and what the supreme being would think. Those are all in our mind. An example of the difference between these is like when I visited the Grand Canyon. My body was very clearly communicating to me to stay away from the ledges. I have a very keen awareness about height, and that is our survival instinct. But my heart beating just as fast, trying to get ready to go out like a club when I was in my early 20s. That was an emotional response conditioned from the fear of rejection. And let me step you through, like a possible scenario of where my mind was at during that process and where the fear was rooted. So it's like, A, if I don't dress right, I won't be accepted by, quote, the important people, and eventually they won't let me in the club, or worse, they let me in and ignore me, rejecting me from my pack in front of everyone. And that led to B, then I'll be on my own. And then went to C, and people will hate me. D, these hating people will run me away from all my friends, and I will be all alone. And then E, I will die alone somehow because no one will be there to care or to help me. And F, finally, I will be remembered as that person no one liked and who no one cared about. And when we say these things out loud, it becomes almost silly, but when we keep the thoughts quiet in the depths of our mind, they do feel believable. Questioning our fears and our beliefs about ourselves, about our world, about our supreme being, questioning on all that allows us to uncondition ourselves. Journaling and writing, these things down allows us to get them out of our head and onto paper, and then we can read them, we can see them, truly see them, and process them as silly lies. In my previous example, I would then ask myself, does being rejected by the important people really mean that everyone would reject me? And how important are these people I think are so important? If they are so awesome, why do I think they judge people so harshly based on what they're wearing or what they look like on the outside? Maybe I need to rethink who is important in my life. And would they really throw me out of a club for not being liked by certain people? Maybe. But if they did, I would find somewhere else to go. There are thousands of clubs in the world, especially back then. And would people hate me for being thrown out of a club? Probably not the people who really knew me and loved me. And if they did, would these haters be able to drive away my true friends? Heck no, they wouldn't. Because if they were able to drive someone away from me, then they weren't really my true friend, and those haters did me a favor by driving them away from me. Hey, my situation's looking up. One of the great things that Byron Katie mentions is that we never really have to try to change our thoughts or let things go. When we begin to question our beliefs and our thoughts, when we see them for the mirage that they are, our brain realizes this untruth and lets the thought go automatically. It's like we know it's a lie now, and we will never believe it again. So it discards it, knowing that it is of no use to us anymore. So no pressure. There is no right way or wrong way to question our thoughts. Just begin to question, and everything will unfold as it will, perfectly. Next episode, we will start questioning our thoughts together. We will approach a variety of common experiences that we all have in our lives and take things step by step as we make our journey coming back from fear. Until next time, use those uncomfortable emotions as a flag that something can be questioned within you. Breathe deeply and ask yourself, what am I really fearing? Every moment is of unconditional love or the fear of losing conditional love. Remember who you are.